Thank you, everyone, for this very rich panel, which I want to emphasize really overturns long-standing notions of the relationship of the Ottomans to their own seas, particularly in the 18th century. I think it was Charles Issaoui, the economic historian of the Middle East, who talks about the Mediterranean becoming a Christian sea as early as the Crusades, right up until the 20th century, with this idea that Muslims didn't go out to sea, and the Ottomans in particular, faced with the inability to maintain their own navy after the end of the 16th century, essentially turned security over to European ships, and in the 18th century particularly the French. And that was sort of the end of the story. So when Michael Talbot says that the Ottomans were not simply passive observers of violence in their own waters, I want to emphasize what a radical claim that is, although apparently not that radical because he really backs it up. Okay, but this is a major claim. This also has to be underlined in terms of Greek historiography. Already Sophia Laou and Jelena Harlaftis in one of their articles, and now this panel continues this, have revised the view that Greek shipping survived, or flourished, I should say, developed in the 18th century. The standard view is not because, but despite the Ottomans. That they turned to the Europeans, they got berats, they got honorary European status, and this was how they protected themselves. Jelena Harlaftis and Sophia Laou have already shown just how many Greek subjects adopted the Ottoman flag at the end of the 18th century. Now here we have Michael showing the constant petitioning in the middle of the 18th century of Ottoman subjects, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, for protection against violence coming from the British and the French. This is also a radical reinterpretation of our views of the 18th century, both for the Ottomans and for the development of Greek maritime activity. So I thank you all for that. Okay. I also wanted to say more generally, and here I begin with my first question, that if we look at what Josh White was talking about yesterday, and generally what we know about the Mediterranean, there is a long-standing pattern, and I'd be interested in your thoughts and also the audience about whether we can construct a long-term history of legal development. There is a long-term pattern of Ottoman subjects shipping their goods in non-Ottoman ships. Right, so we have this in the 18th century, Ottoman subjects putting their goods on French ships, but we have this in the 16th century with Ottoman subjects putting their goods on Venetian ships, and similar problems occur when the Knights of St. John from Malta and other Catholic corsairs or pirates, depending on your point of view, attack Venetian ships and take off Ottoman goods. So this is a long-standing issue. We see particular legal developments at the end of the 17th century. I'm not sure why. I would be sort of interested to hear more. And it also suggests that, this is getting into sort of pure Ottoman historiography, but this idea that the Ottomans did not practice diplomacy until the late 18th century, the reforms of Selim III, this long-standing issue of Ottoman subjects putting their goods on non-Ottoman ships shows that the Ottomans were involved in constant negotiation with European powers in an attempt to protect their subjects' trade. And it also shows that the Ottomans, far from being the caricature still out there of a sort of a landed empire with an indifference to the sea, continuously sought to protect the trade of their own subjects. As Sophia was speaking, it didn't really occur to me when I was reading the papers, but as Sophia was speaking, I thought, well, but the late 18th century suddenly seems to be a bit different. Because the Mediterranean that Michael describes is very much a situation where the Europeans are bringing in violence and the Ottomans are trying to protect and defend their own subjects. By the end of the 18th century, this seems to be a bit different. For the first time, it seems, we have this idea of piracy as potentially presenting a threat of political disloyalty. I'd like to hear more about that. And tremendous trepidation towards one's own subjects. I mean, the flip between Michael and Sophia's talk, where the first is the Sultan protecting his subjects, and the second is the Sultan worried about his own subjects. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Okay. And I'll say some things about each of the papers. Colin Haywood's wonderful sleuthing in the National Archives, it's extraordinary what he was able to uncover, and I appreciate what he did, and also Mr. Gunanis in terms of more of this history from below, which is still very much stillborn when it comes to the Ottoman Mediterranean. We still don't know a lot of individual stories. Here I'm just going to put this question out here, because obviously Professor Haywood isn't here. But I was struck by the beginning of his paper when he talked about that piracy is the capitalism of the poor and the dispossessed. Is that really the case in the Mediterranean? I think you can make that case in the Caribbean. But in the Mediterranean, we have a long tradition of state elites, and here I'm speaking about Catholic corsairing and then the North African corsairs pursuing piracy. We know that the merchants of Livorno, very powerful people indeed, routinely funded corsairing ventures, and it appears that Mr. Roberts himself was pretty good friends with, or at least good enough friends with this British noble in the south of England to dedicate a book to him. So I'm not sure if we should. I'm not sure. The question is how to sort of situate individual seamen like Mr. Roberts socially. Certainly when the British first entered the Mediterranean in the late 16th century, they are seen by everybody as the scum of society, right? These riotous pirates who sort of burn everything in their way. Is that still the case 100 years later? Okay. Professor Gunanis brings out this very important point that I think we always have to keep in mind when we speak about the British or the French in the Mediterranean, that they don't speak with one voice. Okay? I was very aware of this for the French, because I've worked more on the relationship of Greek shipping to Catholic powers. I hadn't realized that the British in the 18th century are still so ambivalent, it seems, about their own corsairs. And I would like to know why, if he has an idea. I was struck by how willing the British are to not accommodate the Ottomans, I mean to sort of accede to their demands, that they compensate Ottoman subjects for the attacks that the British make on French shipping. Because generally, yes, the British appear in the Mediterranean during the 7 Years' War and other conflicts, but generally the 18th century is known as the French century, right? Supposedly the British are off doing other things. The vast majority of trade is carried in the empire by the French, which, as Professor Gunanis points out, which is why this policy of neutrality helps the French more than the British. So I would like to understand more about what British concerns are, why they accede to Ottoman demands. And for both Professor Gunanis and Michael Talbot, I'm particularly interested in the question of Greek shipping, however we define that. And here's an essential part of the old narrative, which I think that they are rapidly overturning. That supposedly as we come into the 17th and 18th centuries, Ottoman shipping is weak, and here the Greeks are very, very prominent because they cannot protect themselves against corsairing attacks particularly from the Catholics, like the Maltese and the Knights of Santo Stefano, although they drop off pretty early. And Ottoman subjects turn en masse to French shipping because it's so safe. It doesn't seem very safe to me. So I would like the comments. I would like to hear more about that. And just very quickly, I was quite fascinated by this quote. Let me see, on page 9 of Professor Greene. He says, sorry for my bad accent, but where this I guess it's Fortunatus says, "Ime pologos monos to nomo, anton paraviasa ala ochis tus prosopos tu sultano, iston idio tu sultano, ise opia ale dinimi yati me anglos, que edra se mendoli tu igomenoma." I'd like to know more about what is behind that attitude. Is that a rejection of the idea that the Ottomans can have sovereignty? And here I'm also having in mind the argument of Edhem el-Dem that by about 1750, the French are starting to exhibit, what can we say, sort of colonial attitudes towards the Ottomans and rejecting the idea that they can be equal players in the world system. Okay, let me move on. I won't take up too much time. The same question to Michael that I asked about to Vasilis. Why is it that the Ottomans are so successful in getting compensation from the British, particularly it's the middle of the 18th century, and if you look across the empire, in all of the cities of the empire, they can't seem to keep the Albanians from stripping villages of everything they have, and yet they're tremendously successful vis-a-vis the British, and I'm quite puzzled by this. As well as this question, if you could keep it in mind, of how safe is French shipping. Let me see if there's one more thing I wanted to ask here. Yeah, just a quick legal question. Another, in May 1744, another declaration was issued by the Sublime Porte, this time to the European ambassadors. It's from page 3 of your paper. This document berated the Europeans for breaking the Ottoman commitment to free and peaceful travel to and from their domains, which was a central tenet in the imperial capitulations. So I'm wondering how that works with, we only claim 3 miles out, right? So what's the difference between the idea in the capitulations that people should be able to sail in and out of the empire freely and this obviously very sort of deliberate change at the end of the 17th century to sort of establishing the line? Sophia Lau's wonderful paper, again bringing up this very, very important point that some Greek Ottoman mariners, at least like Idra, succeeded in close cooperation with, not in opposition to the Ottomans. I also very much appreciate her stand, although you don't put it this way, against environmental determinism, even though the Mani and Idra could both sort of turn to piracy. They're rocks. The two have very, very different relationships with Ottoman authority. I'd like you to comment on what seems to me, what I said before, it seems to be a new world compared to the middle of the 18th century. And what is this? Oh, oh yeah, and it's two more things that I'm done. You talk about this is the age of the reform of the Ottoman Navy. And for both Michael and Sophia, I'd like you to comment on why is it now that the Ottomans decide, you know what we're going to do? We're going to develop our own shipping. Right? Why did they take that decision then? And how do we explain, in the middle of the 18th century, the Ottomans are relying on sort of imposing things on the Europeans, and now at the end of the 18th century, the Ottomans are turning to people like the Idriyots and saying, "You need to keep the shores safe. You need to do the policing." And then how is it that this Kojebaşı in Idra has this relationship as Vakil, as representative of the North African Corsairs? I was completely thrown by that. I have no idea where that comes from. That's all.
Okay, so before we turn it over to the audience, who I know is very eager to get in here, shall we let the presenters speak? And David, do you want to come up here? I'm going to trade places with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I see very few people using the microphone, so the translation service. So I'll respond in English, unless you have an objection. I shouldn't advise anyone to see these privateers as a whole concerning their social status. Fortunato's right was not a really representative case. It was very well known, and his name hit the headlines on whatever was headlines in 18th century British press. But he was very well known, and he's one of the few privateers that has special entry in the national biographies. And the same could be claimed for other people. They were merchants of some standing. They frequented the Mediterranean for quite some time, for 10, 20 years, and they knew the place and the people. I suppose that's why they ran into the chance of increasing their profits as proper capitalists and combining this transport trade with occasional plundering of the ships, of French ships. However, this does not necessarily apply to all the other people that joined the British to participate in this effort against the French. And I'm talking about the Greeks and the Dulcineots and the Montenegrins and other people from all around the Mediterranean who are disregarded by the British ambassadors. Not that they have a better opinion of their own folk, but in any case, they thought that they were the scum of the earth, and they came from the Levant, so they were not used to, they were not honorable in the sense that they used all kinds of tricks, and they deceived the authorities, and the documents were not correct, and so on. And they seemed that they were pretty much obsessed with this view. So yes, some of them were capitalists in the sense that they were merchants for some standing for some time, and also privateers. That's how privateering worked. But this does not necessarily apply to other people that are cooperating in the plundering of the French. The ambassadors were vulnerable as representatives of representing the Levant Company and the communities, because the British trade and the Levant Company was falling apart, and they were not in a position to advance all these flows of capital that you pointed out that they had to. But on the other hand, there was nothing else they could do, because if you read the documents, you see there's always a threat of violence, of a demonstration against the consulate, against the community, of plundering. And we are in the mid-18th century. There were cases that ambassadors and consuls and other people were murdered, so this was not just a threat, but it was a clear and present danger for them that they could be massacred, especially if there was a protest that the Muslims had been stripped of their clothes or deprived of them something valuable. All this was done against a ship going for pilgrimage to Mecca and things like that, which would be an additional reason for a more violent reaction. So they had to pay. They certainly had to. And what else? However, I would like to add a question to yours, to Mr. Talbot, actually. That, all right, the Ottomans were defending, were determined to defend their territorial waters, but we see that they failed. I mean, as he talks about the War of American Independence, then we see an increase in this incidents. Was it because in between there was the Russo-Turkish War and this participation, this Scottish participation, indirect participation in the war, which has created a tradition of Englishmen fighting against the Turks in Chesme and so on? Was it for other political reasons was just because of the knowledge that the empire was falling apart, and we have this period of Russian privateering and cruising in the archipelago in between that actually reduced the ability of the Turks to fight back or... Thank you.
Could I ask you just one?
Yeah.
What about the long-standing view that Ottoman subjects turned to French shipping because it was safe? Is it just safe compared? It was safer than their own shipping, or?
Well, it was safe, provided that there was not a war with the British. And as you said, there were so many French barks of every kind, ships of every kind there available. But on the other hand, which would be an additional question, we both know that sometimes this was done on purpose. I mean, the way that Ottomans are implicated in these affairs is because they give their names and stamps, and they seal the merchandise just to prove that, to give an excuse that they were Ottoman. So you have this tradition. The people know how to handle these cases, either by going to the Pope, to Rome, and applying in the 17th century, or going to London and saying there, no, this are Ottoman. So they know how to use all the legal tricks that are available. So they just survive.
Can I just say something about the British strategy or the British policy? It seems to me that the way it was presented by Michael and Molly's comments, the British come over as being rather a little bit on the defensive, perhaps a little bit weak, by conceding that their citizens had done wrong and therefore paying compensation. So fair enough, and that was rather surprising and very interesting from Michael's paper especially. But we need to put some, dare I say it, some chronology into this. The British were interested in damaging the enemy's trade. The British had, in the 1740s, had damaged significantly the trade, the transatlantic trade of the Spaniards and the French, which was largely carried in their own vessels. And this persuaded the French and the Spaniards to turn to neutral shipping, especially the Dutch and the Danes, etc. So in 1755, 1756, the British changed their strategy, and the rule of the war of 1756 emerged. And this was an attack, an aggressive stance towards neutral trade. In 1759, the British, in response to the complaints and the court and legal actions of the Dutch and the Danes, etc., passed the Privateers Act, which restricted British privateering. It actually constrained it in recognition, seemingly, of the complaints of, the Dutch were fair enough. They were actually conceding this. But the point is, the damage had already been done. The horse had already bolted, and then the British conceded. Now, it seems to me that the Ottoman strategy and the Ottoman situation is a little bit similar. The damage had been done, the Ottomans complain, and the British concede and provide some form of compensation. I don't know whether it's full compensation, but it's monetary compensation after that trade has been intercepted and after the fear had been put into the French or the Ottomans or whoever's carrying the ship, the goods. So the Ottomans are responding, and perhaps effectively, but the British further responding after the damage had been done, literally, at sea. Now, it'd be interesting to know, perhaps Michael knows a little bit more about this, as to whether the British government, seemingly paying compensation, actually passed on that cost to the private individuals involved. Because Fortunatus Wright, Patrick, all the other guys out there, they had to put down a bail, a surety, for good behaviour, and technically that bail should have been prosecuted, and it's the private individuals who pay. So there's a difference between the state and the private individuals. That's a complicated arrangement. So that's an attempt, if you like, to explain the British approach to this, which is pragmatic, entrepreneurial, aggressive, and ultimately, arguably successful. Maybe not so much in the Mediterranean, but certainly elsewhere on the oceans as the century proceeds.
Michael and Sophia, do you want to respond to Molly or actually David before let him?
Great. Well, thank you. Can I respond to yours first? Yeah. The question of compensation is really interesting. There's one case that the Admiralty seems to have paid the British government, but the rest of it seems to be paid by the Levant Company by raising funds from the merchants in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's clear from an Ottoman petition written in Ottoman Turkish on behalf of the British ambassador, who claims poverty. He said, I can't pay this merchant back because we haven't been able to raise the funds from our merchants. So in fact, it's not just hurting the state, it's actually really potentially damaging to the British trade, because these merchants whose trade is already disrupted by the war then have to raise extra funds to pay off the actions of the privateers. So the compensation seems to be really interesting. The question of why is it so aggressive in the American war? Absolutely, it's because of the pressures on the Ottomans after their massive defeat to the Russians, the existing presence of huge numbers of privateering ships, and the fact that the Ottomans and the British almost went to war in that previous conflict because the British were secretly supplying arms to the Russians and the Ottomans kind of noticed. So this extra aggression really definitely seems to have come from that. Okay. Why were the British so successful, and the question of freedom of movement are really kind of interlinked. The capitulations have to be at the heart of everything. We have a treaty or a series of treaties that have been in force since the 1580s. The last one was done in 1675. And it's really clear on what is expected of the British. This is a unilateral treaty. It says, we will give you this if you do that. And the freedom of movement isn't speaking in terms of space in a legal sense. It speaks about merchants coming and going at sea, deria. So just any sea, as long as they can come here, it's fine. That the radical change of the line is that it specifies which bits of the sea. And that, for me, is the interesting point. Why are they so successful? This also links to the capitulations. And this is one of the questions at the heart of my research, well, at least I think that drives me, is who is an Ottoman? Who is subject to Ottoman authority? And British merchants and British subjects are equally subject to Ottoman authority in Ottoman realms. I've just finished writing an article on Takrirs, which are kind of petitionary documents from the British Embassy to the Ottoman government on behalf of commercial matters dealing with British subjects. So if the British want their affairs to be sorted by petition, they have to sort out the affairs that Ottoman subjects have also petitioned. They are equally part of this legal system, this petitionary system. So for me, the capitulations and the legal regime that comes from that helps to explain why the British are so successful. If they don't pay compensation, if they then have a case in an Ottoman court, they're not going to get compensation. So that's how I see it anyway.
Well, I continue the comments of Dr. Talbot, and I strongly believe that a very significant part of the topic of Paris is the capitulations, because if you violate the state's sovereignty, or if you commit a piratical act against an ally or against the state, a ship which transfers the goods of a state that you have capitulations, then it is a problem. This is a problem. It's not only a legal problem. It is I think it's a political problem mainly. And I think that in the second half of the 18th century, I have the feeling that the Ottomans start to reevaluate the capitulation system. And all the nuance of the capitulation system, mainly the foreign protection, the role of the protégé merchants, and the foreign merchants acting in the Ottoman Empire. And this is how they are trying to solve the problem also of piracy. And within this broader revelation, what I would like to stress in my paper was that they are starting to see the piracy as a great problem of state sovereignty. And this is, I think, a modern step or a step towards modernization for the Ottoman state, which begins before Selim III. But because of various political and other events that have taken place in his era, I think Selim III is stigmatized with this reformative agenda. This continues until the Tanzimat, and until the Tanzimat, in the Tanzimat ends, but this is another story. Now about why the reformation of the Navy begins in this period. Well, I think that the Ottomans always had the feeling that they had to, bring new stuff from Europe, mainly for the army or for the navy. But the Battle of Chesme in 1770 had a tremendous negative result, and they realized that they had to do something about the navy, that it didn't bring the results they wanted to. So they began this process of modernization of the Ottoman Navy, and they also took advantage of the Ottoman subjects. I mean, the Hydrids, people from other islands, they were very good experts, okay, in maritime issues and in shipbuilding, so they were eager to bring them to Istanbul and help them to build a new navy. Now,
if I could just interrupt, and that's an interesting combination of old and new, because that's a very, very old Ottoman practice of statecraft, right? To take advantage of, to look at the talents of their subjects and see how they can use them.
Now you asked about the relation of between Vulgaris and Küçük Hüseyin Pasha, if I understood well.
No, how Vulgaris became Vakil for the North Africans.
Oh, well,
That's
first of all, we have the document.
right. No,
we cannot.
Right, but I mean, how did this relationship come about? I mean,
I think that it began during the Küçük Hüseyin Pasha's term as Kapitan Pasha in 1802, when he was supposed, Vulgaris and Hydra was supposed to become an island shelter for all the ships that they were allied with the Ottoman state, and of course the Berber ships were in this, how can I say, Symphonia, in this agreement.
Yeah.
And they continued to, Vulgaris continued to show this kind of political behavior that actually defended and protected the Ottoman interests throughout this period and after his death, Küçük Hüseyin Pasha's death. So it was a result that we can say it was anamenomen. Expected, yes.
Shall we let the audience in?
Okay, thanks. I have two questions for Michael. First of all, on the question of, just it seems like a natural extension I was left wondering about the League of Armed Neutrality in the 1780s, and I think Christoph Neumann has this article about how the Ottomans debated whether to join the League. Is there a connection between that and the story you're telling? And if so, do you know what kind of connection that might be? And my second question is, you say the British... Sorry, is it? Okay. So my first question is about the League of Armed Neutrality in the 1780s and how that interlocks. The second question is, you say the British initially saw the line as being inconsistent with the law of nations, and I'm wondering, did they invoke any sources? Did they mention Grotius? Both, first of all, like in internal correspondence between the British, and secondly, in presenting their claims to the Ottomans, and was there a difference between those two?
The League of Armed Neutrality is a really interesting question, and I don't know is the honest answer, but that is something that I hadn't thought about that is really an interesting point, because it would make a lot of sense that their interest in that would have come from these experiences. So I will look into that. Thank you all. The question of the law of nations is a really interesting one, because it's never, in the submissions in Ottoman Turkish, it's never translated as such. There's no equivalent term. So in the Italian version that's then sent to the translators, it's there. When it comes into Ottoman Turkish, it's not. So, and there's no kind of make-up for it. It just says, you know, this is contrary to the imperial capitulations or something like that. When they're talking amongst themselves, absolutely. And they are all pretty much, I mean, the earlier debates are kind of, yeah, they're more Grotius. But later on, it's more Van Bunkeshoek and the sort of the De Domino Maris, you know, which firmly sets this idea that what you can control is within cannon shot. And that's the kind of the practice that they are attempting to invoke. Of course, the Ottomans have their understanding of the cannon shot rule from very old Islamic traditions that date all the way back to the very earliest Islamic polities in the Mediterranean, that also say that a certain limit from your shore is sacred. So whether it's from usually it's by a watchtower, as far as you can see the light, or as far as you can see the sails of a ship in the distance, that's your water. So, but they obviously weren't aware of how to translate that from Italian to Turkish, so it's missing. But yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment on the question that Professor Greene raised on the privateer who declares loyalty only to his hegemon, the British crown, and no other hegemon, and not the Sultan. And it seems to me that if we were to be talking about a Muslim, of course, a seaman, whatever, we would be talking now about Gaza and about a very sort of ideologically driven declaration that sort of all the issues that we discussed yesterday. And I think that what we're dealing with here is something much simpler, which is just to sort of say something for internal consumption, and whatever the supposed drive is supposed to is for someone in that position, that is there to kind of disguise any other motivations that, again, were discussed yesterday, but this is the proper thing to say. So I wanted to see what the panel's thoughts were on that.
As a matter of fact, and I recall that I did not respond properly to that comment about Fortunato's right, which is very well known, and because these letters have been published a long time ago. It is amazing because it's a kind of declaration in civic terms that an Englishman have rights and so on. I mean, he was sick and tired because he spent a year in the prison, and when he was free, he learned that again the Turks were pressing and saying that all these captures were illegal and they wanted the property back. So he responded to this this proud declaration that if there is a legal case, then it should be brought to the court. But he was also, he thought that he had been mistreated by the High Court of Admiralty and the Admiralty, and they were playing a political game, and he was the victim of this situation. That's why he responded in such a way.
Can I just say a couple of points that Michael made, and that point, it's very reminiscent of the celebrated case of William Kidd. And there are three layers there with Kidd's exploits: the private enterprise, the corporate enterprise of the East India Company, and the state. And what's been said about Fortunatus, right, the Levant Company and the British government in strategic and commercial terms is quite a strong parallel. And of course, William Kidd lost out with his life as a result of this complicated situation. And Fortunatus Wright lost out his freedom for quite a bit of time and felt let down by the authorities, whom he thought he was sort of representing. Yeah, it's an interesting parallel.
But the question of representation of him is really interesting, because in the 19th century he was kind of a hero. And in Liverpool, which is where he comes from, they had celebrations not terribly long ago in his honour. They had a model of his ship in the harbour and they were firing cannons and someone was dressed up as him. Now, if someone was to do that in Algiers and dress up as a Barbary Corsair, or in Tripoli and celebrate that stuff, can you imagine the kind of stuff that would come in the papers about it? And this is what is really interesting about the point you raise is, yes, he's declaring himself as a proud Englishman, and in a sense it's kind of the anti-Gaza, isn't it, in a sense? It's really, really, really interesting, so thank you for raising that.
That says more about Liverpool than Pride.
Well, perhaps. I wasn't going to say anything about it.
I'm from Liverpool, so...
Other questions? Comments? Are you all eager for coffee? Oh, question.
So earlier when we were talking about recompensation from British attacks and the fear that would be brought into the French and Ottoman merchants, the result of this, would the result of this be loss of revenue through having to shift sailing tactics from sailing individually in ships to sailing in large convoys protected by naval fleets? Is this something that the British tried to accomplish in their enemies through their privateer attacks?
There are convoys earlier on. There's a particularly nasty case in the 1690s where a convoy that's on its way to the Levant is completely destroyed, a British one. But they seem, I mean, you probably know much more about this than I do, Professor Ganaris, but I haven't seen much discussion of convoys later on in the 18th century.
The point was always that the French were not using the convoys, and that was precisely the reason why they were defenseless, and they were very easy targets for any kind of ship with a daring captain that would dare to come or violate the shotgun rule and come close to the castles. So that's where the convoys come in, that the French don't use them. So.
But the English did use them earlier?
They did use them, yes, sure. Yes, they did use them earlier.
I mentioned yesterday
And it's made this comment that we use them, and so all this case of privateering does not involve us, because but when we said this argument about neutrality, they want neutrality because they don't use convoys, so they are defenseless.
From what I've read, I mean, again, the sort of extreme fragmentation of these entities that we call the British and the French. The Chamber of Commerce of Marseille wanted its merchants to use the convoys, but they were always saying, it's too expensive. And
we're talking about trade between the islands. It's not a convoy going from Marseille to Smyrna. It's the petty trade that it's profitable for all this Angli-Grec and the other people involved there. They're not going to attack strong ships, big ships coming from Marseille, but small polacers here and there, going from Cyprus to Lebanon and back and forth, and easy targets, yes.
question, comment? Any final comments on Vera? It's
Coffee.
time for
Final
coffee.
comment, coffee.
great papers.
Thank you. I didn't realise that there was
Just